Good morning. We pick up right where we left off last week. And for those of us that weren't here, because I know last week many of us were away celebrating 4th of July. Last week we were talking about the clean and unclean. What makes a person clean? What makes a person unclean? And Jesus was really driving to the point where, the Pharisees were calling the disciples out. They were saying, hey, why don't you guys wash your hands before you eat? Because it's traditional for us. It's something that we do to kind of relate and to remind us that every place we are is in the presence of God. And so we try to be holy as God says that He desires for us to be holy. And Jesus goes on to this long spiel we looked at last week where He's talking about, hey, it's not the outward things that matter to God, rather than it's what's going on in the inside. It's not about the things that you do, but it's more about the condition of your heart that makes a person unclean. And so last week we looked at that. And this week, as we see our passage today, this very famous passage actually that, it's kind of difficult to deal with, and we'll see that this morning. But it picks up right away because Jesus goes on after He teaches about what makes a person clean and unclean. And then He has an encounter with this woman that directly demonstrates His teaching about what makes a person unclean. It's not who they are. It's not what they look like. It's not their status in the society. It's not the things that are on the outside. But rather it's the things that are going on in their hearts. Okay? The story of the Syrophoenician woman, many of us may know this, and it's a very difficult passage to deal with because at times it almost seems like Jesus is speaking against His character. Okay, it seems very not Jesus-like the way He deals with this woman. And so we'll take a look at that and see some of the things that we can possibly learn from this passage. So looking from verse 24, it paints a picture, okay? So Jesus last week He's teaching about what's clean and what's unclean. And then He goes away and He desires to be by Himself. He desires to recuperate. He desires that no one knows that He's there. And notice that throughout the books of Mark that we've been studying thus far, that seems to be the story, okay? Wherever Jesus goes, He's crowded, He's busy, He's always got things going on in His life. And so He desires from time to time to just be by Himself, to recuperate, to pray, to rest. And yet, it seems like that rest keeps getting interrupted for Jesus. And it's the same story here this morning, okay? So He goes away and He desires to be by Himself. And this woman, as soon as she finds out that Jesus is there, she goes immediately to find Jesus. But here's the interesting part. Most of our times, and especially in our passages thus far, when they were describing people, they would usually say she was a Jew or a Gentile or a man or a woman, or a man suffering with this disease, a man with an evil spirit, or a woman with an evil spirit, or a woman that is struggling with this disease of bleeding. Never thus far do we find so much detail about the background of this woman. Okay? If you look at verse 26, we don't have it up here. Maybe we can just go back real quick. If you look at verse 26, Mark includes so much like sociological, like where this person is from, geographical description about this woman. It says the woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. Okay? It's interesting because this is the first time actually a person who comes to Jesus for healing, that kind of background information is given. And it's right after Jesus talks about what it means to be clean and unclean. And so we need to understand why Mark puts that detail in there and why this story follows immediately after the story about what makes a person clean or unclean. So let me give us a little bit of a cultural context for us to make sense of this a little bit more. In the Old Testament, especially in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and in Samuel and the different stories, you'll notice that the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern and to the southern kingdoms. Okay? The northern kingdom was Israel, the southern kingdom was Judah. It happened after the split of King David and his family and all those things. And you see that what happened in the northern kingdom of Israel, there was a queen named Jezebel. And this name should ring a bell because she's one of the most notorious women in the entire Old Testament. Okay? Because she is the epitome of what it means to be an evil woman. Okay? And so what this Jezebel does is that she marries Ahab, the king of the northern part of Israel during that time. And Ahab was not a bad man to begin with. Okay? He followed the Canaanite God. He followed the Jewish Old Testament God. But once he got married to Queen Jezebel, what Jezebel did was that he convinced her, or she convinced him, that they were supposed to worship Baal. Okay? Now, if you recall the story from 1 Kings chapter 18, it's the famous encounter that the prophet Elijah has with the prophets of Baal, with the queen Jezebel, and how he runs away from the queen because why? The queen is doing all these things to kill every last prophet of the New Testament, or the Old Testament God. Okay, so she's very infamous in the Old Testament writings. Okay, she was a Phoenician woman. She was a Syro-Phoenician woman. She was the most famous Syro-Phoenician woman. She is so famous that her name in the Jewish culture in the New Testament times was synonymous as someone who is evil, someone who is manipulative, someone who is somewhat like a prostitute, okay, in the way that she lives her lifestyle, someone that is shameful, a false prophet. In Revelations, it goes even so far as to say this. Revelations 2:20 to 23 says, "Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, the Queen Jezebel from the Old Testament, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols." Okay? And so, when you think about this, the woman Jezebel, and the fact that she was a Phoenician, the fact that she was the one that influenced the Israel kingdom, the northern kingdom, she became it was almost like when you said that name, when you called someone a Jezebel, it was like you were saying that they were immoral sexually, that they were false prophets, that they were people that you were supposed to avoid, people that you're not supposed to be associated with. So in the Jewish context, when you knew that somebody was from Phoenicia or that they were Syro-Phoenician, that was the last person, especially as a teacher, a Jewish teacher, that was the last person you wanted to be seen with. Right? Because she was known, that character, that the name was associated with someone who misleads prophets, that takes the people of God and makes them do immoral things by seducing them. And so it's interesting because why? Mark is giving us this detail because Jesus has just gotten done teaching about this whole thing about what it means to be clean and unclean. It's not the outwardly things, it's the inside. And what happens as soon as he goes on to the other side, there's this woman that by Jewish standards is the most unclean person a Jewish pastor or a teacher can come in contact with. Any Jewish teacher would be in a very sticky position here because they would have said, I cannot be seen with you because if I am, my credibility will go down as well. So you see, when Jesus addresses this person and when Mark gives us this detail and says, hey, this woman is this type of person, Jesus is teaching to his disciples and to all the people that are around there, look, I meant what I said, that the things that make us unclean is not what the outside people say. It's not the definitions of who we are on the outside, but rather what's going on the inside. And then he uses this woman, the most outcast, the most rejected, the most dangerous woman for a Jewish person that desires to be faithful to God, to teach us some things about what's going on the inside of our hearts. Okay, so those are the things that we want to look at this morning. We want to see how Jesus is saying, look, it's not about the outwardly things. It really is about what's going on the inside. And he uses the most offensive person in that time's culture and context to prove that, hey, it's not who she is, it's what's going on in the inside that makes her acceptable to me. Okay? So we'll look at a few things as we come and as we go through the story. The first thing is the way that this person responds, this woman responds to Jesus. Notice in verse 27 that Jesus gives actually a very difficult response to this woman, okay? So she has a child that's demon-possessed. She's got this child that's struggling because she's being tormented by this evil or unclean spirit. And so she knows that Jesus can heal her little girl because she's heard stories of wherever that Jesus goes, that he's doing these miracles, that he's healing people, and that wherever Jesus is, there is healing. And so she comes knowing that Jesus has this authority and comes to Christ and says to him, please heal my daughter, she is sick. Okay? And remember we talked about this whole concept of a heart of a parent that comes begging for their child. She's begging Jesus. She says, Jesus, my girl, she is struggling with this. Please heal. And in verse 27, Jesus says this, and to me this is a very difficult verse because it's so not like Jesus. Jesus says, wait, you have to wait because the healing and the good news that I have is first for the Jews, and if there's anything left over, then the dogs can get some of it. Okay? The pagans or the Gentiles, they were often referred to as dogs in the Jewish culture. If you weren't Jewish by birth, or if you weren't Jewish by family ties, anything else, they were considered to be animals, to be dogs. They would often refer to them as animals, of these dogs. And so it was very customary for people to use that term. And so Jesus goes against everything that we know about who he is, and he calls her, no, you are a dog, and you must wait till my children get fed first. And it's a very difficult verse for me because I look at it and I'm like, Jesus, this is not like you. This is very unlike what you would normally say, and especially in light of what we heard last week, that it's not about the outside, it's about what's going on the inside. So what makes this statement, this woman, the NIV just says Lord, but if you look at other translations and other accounts in Matthew about this event, she actually responds by saying, yes, Lord. And this response, we have to understand, it is amazingly profound the way that she says this. Because what is she doing by saying, yes, Lord, to Christ? She is accepting her place under the table of God. Jesus says to her, no, you must wait because the children of God must be fed first. And if there are any crumbs that fall to the ground, the dogs eat the crumbs. And he says to her, you are like the dog in the standard of our society, and so you must wait because my message is first for the Jews. Now ask yourselves, if you were in this woman's position, if you had a child that was sick, or if you had somebody that was sick, or if you yourself were sick and you came to Jesus and you heard, instead of Jesus saying, hey, come here, I'll give you healing, or let me love you like I've done so many times,